Hello. Just a brief note before we get to the episode. The first bonus episodes are going to be going up on the Patreon very soon. I'm going to be posting an excerpt from one of them to the mainstream, but if you want to hear the rest, you're going to have to be subscribed to the Patreon. These aren't going to be necessary if you just want to hear the main story, but they're going to build out the world of the Lost Sun Society. You're going to hear about life and culture in the RSGs, and we might even have details of the Springtime booklet, which is going to be a really fun read. So just letting you know, you should subscribe to the Patreon if you want some more, and keep an eye out for that excerpt of the bonus episode. So go to the Patreon, it's Patreon/Lost Sun Society, and subscribe to one of the tiers. It'll be worth it. Anyway, on with the episode. It's April. It's 2042. And the world of the 12 minutes and the aftermath feels impossible right now. Plans for a weekend away had been put off time and time again. Over and over, the idea had been floated, affirmed, and then forgotten. Finally, though, it was Grayson who had recognised that they were all expecting to be on leave at the same time, and if they didn't do it now, when were they going to do it? So, they had packed up their kit bags, bought their overpriced train tickets, fumbled through an array of cancellations, and arrived in the Cotswolds for 2 days of idle relaxation. The group had spent most of their lives in secret. It was a choice that they had made, for certain, but it was nice to have a weekend of this, a window into the life that other people lived. They went hiking. Mix found a deer corpse and insisted on posing next to it. The river water was freezing, and Shaw endured all of 2 minutes of it before announcing that he hated swimming anyway. They made a fire, and somehow, between the 5 of them, could scarcely cook a decent meal. They took a picture together, and I look at that picture. The 5 of them, suspended in a moment of warmth and joy, arms wrapped around each other, eyes bright and authentic, and they feel real. But I can't help it. Those people in the picture, with all their warmth and all their humanity, those are the monsters. Welcome back to the Lost Sun Society, Episode 7, Barracudas. The previous passage was based on the Shaw Diary, perhaps one of the only surviving documents we have that details the existence of the Barracuda set in the pre-war years. It's incredibly difficult to procure a copy, and not only that, but owning a copy is likely a dangerous prospect in many states. I think it's worth a read. Now, before that, we have to look at the hours and days before the arrival of the Barracuda into the world of the 12 minutes. Last episode, the declaration of emergency had passed through the hands of the National Reconstruction Committee and effectively entered into force, but now the question of how to deal with the problem of the fallen Northeast RSG was still up in the air. The problem was exacerbated by the fact that the newly crowned leader of the Northeast RSG, the bandit warlord Grinning Reese, had now gained access to the infranet, and he was using it to enact constant provocation. On the daily, the efforts of the Ludek-backed National Reconstruction Committee to control a consistent narrative were being shredded. It was nearly impossible to maintain the idea of a professional and singular government bringing back normalcy, because every day they were being subjected to challenges of their authority, wild demands for freedom, and also straight-up name-calling. Official reports had consistently extolled a decline in banditry, which is arguably true. What we might consider banditry, which is organised small-scale looting and robbery, had instead been replaced with a number of makeshift insurgent armies roaming the countryside. So, yes, there was a decline in banditry, just only in technicality. But alongside these official reports, which were known as commissioner rags, there had also appeared a growing market for black market reports, discreetly printed excerpts from the intranet, which had an enormous audience amongst the otherwise dry environment of the RSGs. These black market rags were discreetly manufactured and distributed by members of the authorities, which avoided the more overbearing censorship of the commissioners, and as such could afford to take a dirtier, meaner, and overall more dramatic approach. They took the dry minutiae of the daily minutes and converted them into a drama deserving of the theatre. The audiences revelled in the personalities of the National Reconstruction Committee. They picked sides in otherwise obscure debates and engaged in small-scale betting and gambling on the outcome of votes. They also engaged in fanciful speculation about the Bandit Kings, because the truth was that the public both equally feared and admired many of the Bandit Kings. They were real-life daredevils. They were interesting, even if they were armed to the teeth and prepared to burn things to the ground. The rapid growth of these black market rags had meant that the central narrative that Ludek had been trying to control had essentially disintegrated, and it meant that the issue of the Northeast RSG was one which he was soon deciding could not be ignored. However, if we do take a moment and switch perspectives, we can also see that things were not going so well on the side of the quote-unquote newly restored and liberated Northeast RSG. The transition from insurgent to incumbent was never easy, and the one-for-all approach of the Bandit Kings was not as well suited for the rigid structure of the RSG as it was for the countryside. He had a number of obligations to both the people who formed the core of his group and those who had just chosen to throw out their previous administration in favour of his own leadership. As you can imagine, the relationship between these two groups immediately became strained. For one, Rees was practically forced to ensure that his closest confidants were appointed to key positions within the RSG, which was only ever going to cause drama with the people who had previously held those roles. And then this only got worse when it became very apparent that the thugs and soldiers of the Bandit King were not well suited for really any of the administrative roles. Unfortunately, if you wanted a key role within the RSG, if you wanted any real power, well, it came with an administrative role. It was all spreadsheet and maths, and there wasn't really any other option. So Rees was trying to make circle pegs go in square holes, but nobody ended up happy. It didn't suit anyone. An RSG was practically a closed ecosystem, one which could run itself for a number of years, provided it had careful management. Unfortunately, there was no careful management in sight, and the closed ecosystem could rapidly fall into a cascade of failures, which is exactly what happened. This was not just an issue of failure in regards to the intranet, but the very basics of life within the RSG. Failure could mean a shutdown of the hydroponics. It could mean that water purification collapsed, and that could lead to the disintegration of the connections between the RSG and the local communities that surrounded it. At this point, it becomes clear that the Bandit King himself had been relying on two major factors to aid him after his ascension, both of which had never materialized. The first had been his hope to establish an ongoing relationship with the Hexham RSG, which is known as RSG 2.2, or the Northeast Minor RSG. Hexham had been designed as a redundant RSG, a backup in case of failure at the Shipton RSG. Although in reality, Hexham had immediately been populated following the 12 minutes, given that, well, there was no reason to just let it sit there. It had been headed by a far more competent commissioner than the triad of the Central Northeast RSG. A civil servant called Erling Hawkins had ended up in charge, and he had been chosen from amongst a closed group of civil servants. The two Northeast RSGs had been working in tandem with each other ever since the 12 Minutes, and had created a series of informal trading agreements with one another. One RSG might have needed specialist parts, and the other RSG could provide it, with the understanding that they would return the favour later. Upon the ascension of Grinning Reese to the role of commissioner, however, Erling Hawkins immediately broke off any attempts at communication or cooperation. He adopted a line of complete, resolute non-negotiation until the Bandit King restored so-called proper administration. Reese had charisma in buckets, he had weapons, and he had men, but he simply could not break through the resolve of Mr. Hawkins, who returned the same message at every attempt at communication. This move had completely undercut any authority that Reese had hoped to establish for himself, and critically, it dried up any and all of the essential trade that had been sustaining the bunker itself. Those earlier failures weren't coincidence. The second major factor that Reese had been planning for, or possibly hoping for, is something that we can find repeatedly referred to in his communiques with the National Reconstruction Committee. He made constant and repeated references to a wave of pressure from both his fellow Bandit Kings and the citizens working within the RSG. Reese had only really become aware of the bandits when he had arrived and gained access to the intranet, but he had come to see their struggle as one united front. To be perfectly clear, he was not expecting any of his fellow insurrectionists to take an RSG, especially not as easily as he had. But he had expected that continuous pressure from the other Bandit Kings would have had a knock-on effect that would have empowered his own position and undermined those of the committee. However, when we look at the situation of the boots on the ground, we see that the conflicts had lapsed into a stalemate since the declaration of emergency. The bandits had excelled in an environment of confusion and fear, but now they were being treated like a credible military threat, and their tactical capabilities had been proven wanting. Now that the military authorities had been empowered by the declaration, they had been operating in a far more ruthless and coordinated fashion. The intranet now also provided an indispensable tool, as military authorities began to autonomously coordinate their efforts against the Bandit Kings. The Bandit Kings had also unknowingly triggered a wave of reorganization and growing militarization across the Isles, which stretched beyond the confines of the RSGs. The outside threat conspiracy, that idea that there were waves of foreign soldiers coming to invade Britain right now, had taken root in villages, in towns, and in the remnants of cities. The idea that these bloodthirsty invaders were about to enter your home, it had empowered both the paranoid and the cautious, and local militia had begun to crop up, from the allies of the RSGs to the White Banners and the Preppers. All of this meant that for the bandits there were no more easy pickings. There were no villages or towns that were willing to throw open their doors and welcome the bandits in as liberating heroes. Every advance was now going to be a fight, and not every group of bandits had the capacity to take those fights. It was much easier to just hold on to what you had and hope that you could negotiate a quick exit with the authorities. So it appeared that the wave of revolution and liberation had not accompanied the Bandit Kings. Grinning Reese was isolated, his power was failing, his supposed allies had little interest in his existence, and there was a fair chance that if the RSG was left alone for a few more weeks, it would have collapsed entirely. But the National Reconstruction Committee was not aware of any of this. Within the committee, the Crown Group had continued to organise itself and grow its ranks, and Lockridge had been dictating the battles which they would fight, one at a time. This was, of course, aided by the fact that the Crown Group had an ideological drive that their opponents in the Architects did not really have, and it was further aided by the fact that they were committed to a fight that the Architects did not even realise they were engaged in. Ludek had been cautiously engaging with some of the ideas of the Crown Group without realising that there was a Crown Group. The real coup had been the declaration of emergency, and this brief alignment with the Central Commissioner had empowered the Crown Group to begin to act of their own accord. But despite this, the issue of the North East RSG had proven to be a sticking point, and Lockridge had been denied his desired outcome again and again. To make it completely clear, Lockridge had been aiming solely for the restoration of a singular unified British armed forces, operating with its own military council. He had been arguing that whilst the National Reconstruction Committee could be considered the civilian arm of the national government, the current situation required that there be a military arm. This was opposed by many members of the Architects, who had all managed to agree that the current system of autonomy, imperfect though it was working. The declaration of emergency had been a clean and simple solution which had slowed the advance of the Bandit Kings and even reversed it in some cases. They argued that come May or June, there might not even be a threat anymore, and that a restored military council of such a degree that Lockridge was asking for would only create further barriers to their efforts. Barriers that would impede the operation of the military authorities in their current state. The infranet wasn't perfect, after all, and how much momentum would they lose whilst endlessly waiting for orders to transmit and then retransmit? But Lockridge was completely married to the idea of military force as a response to the Bandit Kings. He did not want to wait to simply disarm the bandits. He wanted to crush them. It was, as he thought, a preventative measure. A complete and overwhelming response to the Bandit Kings would be the only way to dissuade any future insurgencies. So, despite the opposition from his Architect enemies, he began to look, subtly, for ways in which he could circumnavigate the issue. Eventually, he found one. The soldiers of the RSGs had been formed from reserves of the British military, working in tandem with members of the former law enforcement who had been uplifted into the roles of soldiery out of necessity for maintaining order. The soldiers had been pulled from a number of military installations from across the UK and had been assimilated into whichever RSG was closest, and there had been a number of installations that had been written off or entirely destroyed during the 12 minutes. What Lockridge discovered was that there was a military installation that had not been incorporated into the East Midlands RSG, because none of the military administrators or commissioners in the East Midlands RSG had ever been aware of its existence. This meant that there was a group of soldiers that had been working under the authority of no one, and they could be brought under the wing of the Crown Group exclusively. So he reached out, and he discovered why no one had been informed of its existence. Skendleby Base, which was only an informal designation rather than an official one, had existed off the records. The lax rules of the Rotten system had allowed for Britain's allies to use the island as a home for military projects that might have otherwise been off limits for them, and Skendleby was one such project. It had appeared as nothing more than a set of developments on official maps for years, and it would have been easily missed for years to come if Lockridge had not specifically been searching. The people who had been aware of its existence were likely buried under rubble in the heart of London, and so the base had likely been suspended in a state of isolation. They had been waiting for orders that never came, and so they had decided to remain in isolation. It was easy enough to reach out to once one knew that it existed, and Lockridge pulled strings with his allies in the East Midlands RSG to establish a point of contact. Now, just as a heads up, I'm about to start using the term Barracudas, and I'm going to use its multiple meanings rather interchangeably as we discuss their history. But I'm going to try and explain the distinctions. When I refer to Barracuda Squad, I'm referring to all the residents of Skendleby Base, of which there numbered around 70, members of the clandestine project that was the purpose of the base. This was their official designation, which at one time had been part of a group of 3 designations. There was Archer, Barracuda, and Crane, although we don't know what happened to the other 2. But when I refer to just the Barracudas, I'm referring to those who would become known as the Barracuda Set, which is the 5 individuals who came to be the informal leaders of the group. The Set were the Butchers, the Revolutionaries, and the Monsters. Now, to broach the subject of why all of this was so hush-hush, the Skendleby project had been an attempt to militarize a number of technologies that had only been made possible through the rapid advancement of technology in the 21st century, and the members of Barracuda Squad had been its outcome. Each member of the squad was a military veteran. They had previously served in one of the kingdom's many wars, and they specifically had been rendered disabled by their time in the force. They had seen war in the Baltics and the blood in the Mediterranean, and they had been scarred for it permanently. The vast majority of veterans from these conflicts would simply be disillusioned by them. But there was also an unfortunate truth in the reality of being a disabled veteran during the time of the Rotten system. There wasn't a lot of work, and it was hard enough to get without the additional weight of disability and violent trauma. But even with all of that said, it still took a certain kind of mind to be approached for the Skendleby project, and those who would become future members of the Barracuda Squad had accepted that without question. They had elected to undergo a number of surgeries that would completely integrate them within the military apparatus. The heart of this was a neural chip, that is to say, a small computer designed by an overseas company which was implanted within the brain. The chip had 3 purposes. The first was to integrate the prosthetics of the recipient with their brain, and which was why all of the members of Barracuda Squad had been disabled. The second was to integrate the recipient's brain with the onboard computer. And the third was to allow for short-range communication between the chip itself and other chips in the vicinity, in much the same way the average mobile phone of that era could communicate with others. And I'm going to confess now, even speaking these words feels strange. We're 200 years divorced from the time of the Barracudas, and across that time, the methods and realities of the Barracudas have been mythologized, lionized, and elevated. They are saints, and they are sinners. They are beasts from the past world, and they are the faces of the coming revolutions. The technology itself is but one part of these myths. It is proof of their divinity. It is proof of their heresy. It is evidence that they were more than human, or it's evidence that they had surrendered their humanity. It's the kind of thing that certain states will shoot you just for discussing, but that's a risk I have to take for the sake of the society. And besides, the truth was that it was all mundane. It was an attempt to extract every last percentage of efficiency out of the average soldier. They were not better than human. They were not beyond human. They were fallible and vulnerable in all the same ways that the soldiers tended to be. But it's easy to get swept up in the imagery of it. A member of the Barracuda Squad had a delicate web of filigree that ran across their outer arms and across their spine. It was made out of a lightweight 3D printed material that had a habit of catching the light. People from that era talk about how a member of the Barracuda Squad had presence in any room they were in. It was just impossible to ignore. They appeared brilliant. There was nothing like them. But make no mistake, the end result of this was exclusively that it allowed for a soldier that had the relative autonomy of a human with the split-second assessment capabilities of a computer. Lockridge did not have sight of all these details at that time, but he immediately recognized the value of a blunt military tool that could be used by the Crown Group against its enemies, a tool which would only answer to him, and which would be able to move across the landscape of the Isles without being tied to any one location. For now, his enemies were solely found in the Northeast RSG, and the location of the Skendleby project put it right on the doorstep of the rogue Bandit King. What Lockridge then performed was a truly outrageous piece of theatre, which can only be admired for how much he blatantly distorted the truth. To the Barracudas, who had remained broadly unaware of happenings within the RSGs or the committees, he presented himself as, and I'm not making this up, an interregional commissioner for the Greater Southern Region, a title which did not exist and never would exist. And he stated that he had been empowered by the declaration of emergency to appropriate any resources which could be necessary for the survival of the nation. This, of course, included the assets and personnel of the Barracuda squad. He then cited several non-existent provisions which supposedly existed within the national emergency response, not even the declaration of emergency, and used these non-existent provisions to then authorize the deployment of the Barracuda squad against the Northeast RSG. It's not entirely apparent that Lockridge needed this much elaborate lying to reach the outcome that he wanted, but during that March of 2045, it worked. The Barracudas, much like many of the RSGs, had been operating with an informal system of leadership since the 12 minutes. A close-knit group had emerged from the rank and file of the squad and taken on the duties of organising their compatriots. It had been helped by the closeness of this group prior to the war. They were all intimately familiar with each other in a way that only squad mates could be. This group had also recognised that if they were going to accept the authority of Lockridge, it was only fair that they were the first to be volunteered for whatever was coming. That group, as you're no doubt aware, was Hudson Shaw, Grayson Brown, Michaela Levine, Mason Hart, and Avery Lawrence. The Barracuda set. Lockridge had left the assembled group with wildly inconsistent language on the capacity of their mission. He had clearly stated that the Bandit King himself needed to go, that was for sure, but everything else was cloaked in language that was deliberately obtuse. Evidently, he had been prepared to distance himself from the outcome of this event if it went anything other than swimmingly, but the world where that happened never came to pass. I think one of the more under-discussed points in the history of the Aftermath must come in the journey of the Barracudas towards the Northeast RSG. What were they thinking at that time? Were they aware of how much impact they were about to have on the course of their home? Did they talk about what was to come, or did they talk about literally anything else? What we do know is that they did not announce their coming. They did not give the RSG an opportunity to react, perhaps because they had been specifically instructed by Lockridge not to. On March 23rd, 2045, the Northeast RSG awoke to gunfire. Warfare in the Aftermath period was a beast that was different to any other warfare of the 21st century, in that it was entirely defined by scarcity. Every bullet was a resource that could not be replenished easily. There was not a roar of jets or a rumble of tanks, not even the electric whine of drones, because all of those took fuel that could not be supplied. Warfare in the Aftermath was simply about the bodies that one could muster, and how many bullets they had available to throw at their enemy. For most of 2043 and 2044, the Bandits had held the advantage in that they had mustered a force that was broadly more motivated than their opponents within the RSGs. The average RSG soldier just wanted their daily bread. The average bandit thought they were playing a part in some grander liberation. But they were nothing compared to the echoes of a different kind of war. The integrated systems of a member of the Barracuda squad made them terrifying to face. The neural implant was built with a rudimentary intelligence that was updated with information of the battlefield in real time, and which it used to spot enemy combatants for its human operator. It could then work with the integrated prosthetics and direct the aim of the operator, effectively cutting out human reaction times and errors. It always fired quicker than you, and it always fired more accurately than you. But this was all experimental. It wasn't the norm for warfare at that time, and there were flaws. The system for recognizing enemy combatants, for example, was completely flawed. The intelligence simply couldn't register enemy combatants. It just knew how to distinguish between humans and the environment. It had no real method of distinguishing between combatants and civilians. But then, this only mattered if you cared about civilian casualties. The Barracudas did not, and they had been specifically chosen for the project because they had no such objections. The Second Battle of Shipton is not known as the Second Battle of Shipton. It is known as the Shipton Massacre, because the Barracudas simply cut a bloody path from the exterior of the bunker into its interior, through any of the meagre resistance or pleadings for mercy until they reached the centre. Armed with automatic weapons and an intelligence that could identify, target, and execute within a matter of milliseconds, the Barracudas took mere hours to storm the bunker and then summarily execute Grinning Reese. The surviving accounts we have of this event are truly chilling, and they are not for the faint of heart. And the thing that makes them most chilling is their description of the silence that accompanied it. The implants were capable of communicating with each other in real time, and they broadly eliminated the necessity of squad mates to talk to each other in the heat of battle. So the Butchers were silent as they moved forward, silent apart from the bark of their rifles. These were the hammer of a kind of state that no longer existed. Caspar Lockridge had unleashed it, but he did not realise just what he was playing with, and he would soon come to realise that this was a force that he could not control. On the 24th of March 2045, the other RSGs were informed that the Northeast RSG had been retaken. Grinning Reese was gone, and they should expect a resumption of normal activity in due course. The Architects, Ilsa Ludek, and the Crown Group would all have varying comments about how this was a pleasant surprise, and it would take time for them to learn of what had truly transpired. They were all of them doomed, but they would not yet realise it. Next episode, the backlash from the Shipton Massacre is finally going to awaken the Architects to the threat posed by the Crown Group, and Caspar Lockridge is going to be forced to make a desperate play to survive. He's going to be forced to produce the Newfield Note. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, do go support us on Patreon. It's the best and most direct way to ensure that the show can keep going, and you get access to all the episodes without any of the annoying ads. All the tiers get access to the same content, so you can pay as much or as little as you want. Go to patreon.com/LostSunSociety, all one word, or check out the link in the description. I'll see you next episode.